In the 1990s, particularly on the west coast of the United States, anti-drug public service announcements, known as PSAs, weren't just part of the media landscape. They dominated it. These campaigns were everywhere. They played in commercial breaks, during Saturday morning cartoons, appeared as segments between after-school programming blocks, and were looped into cable access specials. Teachers rolled televisions into classrooms to play them. They echoed over the crackling speakers of middle school auditoriums. They were worked into class activities and health curriculums, and sometimes even entire assemblies were built around them. These messages weren't just about information. They were about transformation. The goal, at least in theory, was to intervene before curiosity could turn into experimentation, and to show kids the hard, grim consequences of messing around with drugs. The approach, however, was often so melodramatic, so exaggerated, or so culturally tone-deaf that the opposite effect took hold. Rather than convincing kids to steer clear, many PSAs became punchlines, remembered less for their cautionary tales and more for their unintentional hilarity. Before dissecting the neon-colored absurdity of 1990s drug PSAs, it's worth digging into the deeper history that led to their creation, especially on the West Coast, where much of America's modern drug narrative took root in the early 20th century, long before crack cocaine and D.A.R.E mascots. Cities like San Francisco became ground zero for early drug legislation. These laws were aimed largely at opium use, but they weren't just about health. They were laced with xenophobia, targeting Chinese immigrant communities who are often portrayed as the face of moral decay. The Smoking Opium Exclusion Act of 1909, among other local ordinances, laid the groundwork for a legal framework that blurred the line between health policy and racial politics. As these local bans spread and hardened into federal policy, they ushered in a new era of prohibition and surveillance, one that would only escalate in the decades to come. By the time the 1970s rolled around, President Nixon had declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one, launching the so-called War on Drugs, a campaign that would balloon into a sprawling, punitive juggernaut. Nixon's policies, though cloaked in rhetoric about rehabilitation, leaned heavily into enforcement and criminalization, planting the seeds for a much broader cultural crackdown. The West Coast, already synonymous with counterculture, thanks to movements in San Francisco, Berkeley, and Los Angeles, found itself at the center of this new moral panic. What had once been hotspots for psychedelia and free expression now became battlegrounds in a federally sanctioned war. Then came the 1980s, when President Reagan took that war and turned it into a full-blown domestic assault. His administration didn't just go after suppliers, it went after entire communities. Crack cocaine, which was chemically similar to powder cocaine, but more widely used in poorer black neighborhoods, was met with drastically harsher sentencing. California became a testing ground for some of the era's most extreme policies, with initiatives like three strikes laws and widespread militarized policing that flooded low-income areas with SWAT-style drug raids. In cities like Los Angeles, whole neighborhoods were transformed into conflict zones. Rather than treating addiction as a medical issue, the state criminalized it, drawing a hard line between clean citizens and the so-called criminal underclass. Rehabilitation took a backseat to punishment, and the public was fed a steady diet of fear. As drug policy tightened, media portrayal of drug use in West Coast cities became more exaggerated. In particular, Los Angeles came to symbolize the country's worst fears about drugs and violence, thanks in part to the visibility of gang conflicts and the dramatic rise of the crack epidemic. It's true that drug problems were serious, and the intersection of poverty, lack of access to health care, and systemic inequality made certain communities especially vulnerable. But the narrative spun by the media, politicians, and law enforcement suggested a total societal collapse that wasn't quite accurate. Imagine this. Parents already struggling with the paranoia of Cold War politics, the fear of violent cinema and sex-obsessed media right in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and corruption in the state at both local and national levels, being told that every child from Calexico to International Falls, from Crescent City to Cape May was either already an active drug fiend or a potential one, and that their own children were probably hiding the truth that they were already addicted to one of a number of banned substances. The brainwashing was very real and in full force during this period. If your kid listened to certain music, liked to watch Scarface with Al Pacino, had a Che Guevara poster on their wall, or spent a little too much time out in the evening, they were already in the dastardly clutches of Pablo Escobar, and that he was sitting in his fortified drug kingdom down in Medellin, sipping cocktails and feeding pet tigers, which had been paid for by the money your child had spent on his product that was now turning their brains to liquid. And before long, they'd end up as a drooling vegetable. Now, don't get me wrong, things like this did happen. There were addicts, obviously, and for some, it did go tragically wrong. Trust me, I witnessed a few examples myself that I'll explain later. But the idea of an entire generation of kids being lost to drugs was more myth than truth. Data from the early 1990s shows that teen drug use had actually fallen since the 1970s in many parts of the country, including on the West Coast. Yet the dominant narrative ignored nuance. It focused on spectacle. And into that spectacle walked the PSAs. Politicians funneled money into anti-drug programming, hoping to reach young people before the drugs did. These funds supported a wide range of efforts, from glossy national ad campaigns to ultra-local school presentations. Non-profit organizations, government agencies, and self-appointed youth outreach experts sprang into action, many with good intentions but varying degrees of effectiveness. What this looked like on the ground was a rotating cast of performers and presenters, often college students, amateur actors, or aspiring motivational speakers, hopping from one school to the next in vans full of cardboard props and boom boxes. They came wearing branded t-shirts and earnest smiles, ready to perform choreographed skits, lip-sync to pop songs, and deliver heavily scripted monologues about the perils of peer pressure, addiction, and bad choices. The people behind these assemblies were usually not professionals in the traditional sense. They were often college students, unpaid volunteers, or members of small traveling troupes who specialized in educational outreach. Some may have been part of campus clubs, looking to rack up volunteer hours, while others were likely participating in community service programs or arts-based prevention initiatives funded through public health grants. These groups would travel from school to school, armed with boomboxes, homemade props, and an arsenal of well-meaning skits that blurred the line between theater and health class. Their mission was clear: scare or inspire children into avoiding risky behavior. Though they weren't officially affiliated with the better-known D.A.R.E program, they existed in a similar ecosystem. Where D.A.R.E used uniformed police officers, classroom handouts, and highly structured curriculums, these theater groups opted for emotion, spectacle, and raw enthusiasm. They filled a cultural niche, offering live, in-your-face demonstrations of the perils of bad decisions, often to kids who hadn't even encountered those decisions yet. Ironically, in their effort to shield children from temptation, they sometimes gave detailed, vivid previews of what those temptations looked like. For many kids, these presentations were their first exposure to the concept of drugs, or drinking, or sex, as anything other than vague adult warnings. And then, of course, there were the PSAs, those unforgettable, often absurd, sometimes disturbing public service announcements that aired during commercial breaks on TV and played on VHS tapes in classrooms. Among the most iconic was the "This is your brain on drugs" spot, where a serious-faced man in a kitchen cracks an egg into a sizzling frying pan. "This is your brain," he says, holding the raw egg aloft. "This is your brain on drugs." As the egg spatters and fries, he stares into the camera and delivers the final blow. Any questions? It was blunt. It was dramatic. It was endlessly parodied. At the time, it had an eerie simplicity that made it stand out from the louder, more chaotic ads. It didn't feature teens in jail cells or crying parents. It was just eggs in a pan. For many kids, it became burned into memory, repeated on playgrounds, quoted in jokes, and even reimagined in school projects. But while the image stuck, its intended effect didn't always land. Despite the ominous tone, the PSA didn't necessarily prevent anyone from lighting up behind the 7-Eleven after school. If anything, it became shorthand for outdated adult fear-mongering. It worked as branding, but not necessarily as prevention. Still, in the pantheon of 90s drug education, few images loom larger than that egg cracking in a hot pan, sizzling in metaphor. Other PSAs tried even harder to leave a mark, and in doing so, ended up failing just as memorably. One of the more bizarre and unintentionally comedic examples featured a Monty Python parody, even voiced by former Python alumni John Cleese, where a tiny man climbs into the top of a teenager's hollow head by way of a ladder. Once inside, the viewer was treated to a cavernous, echoey brain interior that looked more like a tin can than a skull. The narrator's voice calmly declared, "If you could get into the mind of a pothead, you might not find anything at all." After a beat, he spotted a single corn puff lying on the floor of the teen's mental void. Or maybe you would. "Look, a corn puff," he added, taking a bite with a dramatic crunch before climbing out the way he came. It was supposed to be a dire warning about the cognitive effects of marijuana use, but instead, it played like a genuine Monty Python sketch in which you're not meant to take it seriously. Rather than scaring kids straight, it sparked laughter and left most viewers with the impression that pot simply made you snacky and slightly spacey. Not exactly the apocalyptic message intended by the campaign. The visual absurdity and deadpan delivery made it more likely to be quoted in the cafeteria than taken seriously. Another PSA leaned hard into horror movie aesthetics, featuring a young boy quietly holding a basketball alone in a dimly lit room. As a shadowy figure loomed nearby, an ominous voice whispered, "I can make your parents go away." The camera lingered on the boy's frightened face before cutting to the basketball, slowly bouncing down a deserted hallway. The tone was grim, the message deliberately unsettling. It felt more like The Cold, open to a thriller, than a piece of educational outreach. And while it certainly left an impression, many kids remembered it years later, mostly because of the creepy ambiance. It raised more questions than it answered. Who was the shadowy figure supposed to represent? A drug dealer? Addiction itself? A metaphor for abandonment? It didn't clarify anything, it just delivered vibes. The intended takeaway that drugs lead to isolation and danger got buried beneath the spooky presentation. It was fear-based messaging without substance, and the lack of clarity only reinforced the sense that the adults behind these PSAs didn't actually understand how kids thought or what they needed to hear. By contrast, there were a few PSAs that broke the mold, opting for subtlety and relatability instead of dramatics and doom. One that stood out for its measured approach depicted a teenage boy being offered drugs in a school hallway. Before responding, the teen imagined a rapid sequence of internal questions. What if my parents find out? What if they don't? What if this changes everything? As he considered the outcomes, fleeting visions of his parents, future aspirations, and personal integrity flashed through his mind. Ultimately, he turned down the offer. Rather than reacting with peer pressure or mockery, the other kids simply nodded and said, "Cool." That ending alone was a quiet revolution for anti-drug media at the time. It didn't try to shame, frighten, or moralize. It just portrayed saying no as normal, even respectable. There were no frying pans, no grave consequences, and no dancing mascots. Just a realistic scenario and a moment of pure respect. It may not have gone viral or burned itself into the pop culture lexicon, but among a sea of melodrama, it stood out precisely because it treated kids like they had brains and agency. And then there was Cartoon All-Stars to the Rescue, arguably the most surreal and ambitious anti-drug PSA ever created. More than just a commercial, it was a full-blown animated special that brought together an all-star cast of beloved cartoon characters. Bugs Bunny, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Alf, the Muppet Babies, and more, all assembled to save one boy from the perils of marijuana. The program was introduced with a solemn message from President George H.W. Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush, setting a grave tone that immediately clashed with what followed. A technicolor whirlwind of animation and over-explained morality. The premise was that a young boy was beginning to experiment with drugs, so his sister's stuffed animals came to life and summoned an interdimensional league of cartoon icons to intervene. What followed was a psychedelic ride through peer pressure, poor decisions, and wide-eyed animated concern. On the West Coast, kids tuned in after school expecting cartoons and got a lecture from Garfield about gateway drugs. While the production values were impressive and the voice acting on point, the absurdity of it all rendered the message somewhat hollow, even in its original broadcasts. The special bordered on self-parody. The final takeaway seemed to be, smoke weed and your toys will start snitching. Despite its earnest intentions and monumental coordination across networks, it felt more like a stoned fever dream than an effective deterrent. The legacy it left was more about its novelty than its cautionary wisdom. Kids remembered the crossover event, not the warning it was built around. However, by far the most memorably misguided drug PSA was one that may not have been made in the 1990s, but certainly continued to get airplay into the new decade. In 1986, the late Paul Reubens, better known as Pee Wee Herman, stepped out of his colorful playhouse and into a stark, serious setting for an anti-drug PSA that left younger viewers baffled and older viewers laughing so hard they couldn't breathe. Gone were the bright sets, talking furniture, and manic giggle that had made Pee-wee a household name. Instead, he stood against a shadowed background in his familiar gray suit and red bow tie, addressing the camera with a solemn expression. "This is crack. Rock cocaine. It isn't glamorous or cool or kid stuff," he warned, holding up a small vial of the drug like a piece of evidence. The words landed heavy, the tone utterly foreign to anyone used to Pee-wee's zany antics. It was a jarring collision of childhood innocence and adult dread, and for many kids, it was like watching their favorite Saturday morning character suddenly step into a crime drama. It felt wrong, eerie even, like waking up to find your favorite cartoon hero had joined the evening news. For adults, though, it was the most hilarious thing they'd ever seen. I remember well when this first came on TV when I was 9 years old. And while I didn't get exactly what was going on, my mom, sitting next to me on the couch that afternoon after school, suddenly falls over onto the cushions in hysterics, with tears streaming down her face, gasping for air like she'd just been deposited into outer space. My dad comes in from the kitchen, unaware of what my mom had just witnessed, and she can't explain it to him because no mix of coherent words or thoughts could possibly describe the fact that someone, somewhere, thought Pee-wee Herman, of all people, acting as seriously as David Frost during the Nixon interviews, should be the one to tell children about the dangers of cocaine. It was only years later, with the magic of YouTube, that I was able to hunt down this bad boy for myself and witness with my own eyes the absolute insanity and hilarity of a Pee-wee drug PSA, one that is now passed around like the best joke ever written, over and over again. What made it stranger was the timing. Paul Reubens' real-life image would take a hit just a few years later after his 1991 arrest for public indecency in a Florida adult theater. And though the PSA predated that scandal, it retroactively became tangled with it in the public's memory. By the early 90s, many adults looked back at the ad and saw it not as public service, but as damage control, a preemptive bid to cast Reubens as a family-friendly moral crusader. Either way, if anyone ever wondered what the killing joke from Monty Python might have been, then perhaps this 57 seconds of your life, this mess so utterly misguided, like a missile launched by accident and flying around the sky looking for an unaware innocent target, might be a contender. 5 years later, another peculiar creation arrived in classrooms and public access channels. The Adventures of R.F. Ant, Part 1, Stimulant Drugs. Released in 1991, the animated short was produced by the University of Arkansas, but widely distributed across California as part of early drug education initiatives. It was the kind of low-budget VHS teachers would pop into the VCR on a Friday before lunch, the lights dimmed, the class fidgeting in their seats. The film introduced R.F. Ant, a cartoon insect whose mission was to teach kids about the dangers of stimulants, everything from caffeine and diet pills to amphetamines, crack, and methamphetamine, or ICE, as the script called it. The goal was noble, to make the science of drug addiction digestible for young minds through bright animation, goofy humor, and anthropomorphic charm. R.F. Ant himself was designed to be approachable, wide-eyed, upbeat, endlessly optimistic. He scurried around explaining how drugs affected the brain and body, warning his fellow insects about the dangers of quick fixes and bad choices. The voice acting was exaggerated to the point of parody, and the animation, while ambitious, felt a step behind Saturday morning standards. Characters moved in stiff, jerky motions, their mouths lagging behind the dialogue, and it had a weird propensity for characters to be partially cut off at the edge of the frame, which was kind of weird. Surely someone should have checked for that, right? Still, there was something strangely endearing about it, the way earnest educational programming sometimes is. The thing I remember the most, though, was the background score, which was pure early 90s synth. Chirpy, repetitive, slightly off-key. But I've got to say, at some points, it kind of rocked. The bit with the girl ant, whose name I can't remember, where she overdoses on the dance floor. I know this is going to sound shameful, but I remember my 15-year-old self jamming to the little rock song they had going in the background. I know her plight was very sad, and I should have been feeling sorry for this character, but I wanted to go rocking at that club, and I wondered where it might have been. In the Mission? The Fillmore? Soma? To be brutally honest, none of us were really paying attention that day. A boy in our class who had been giving photos of himself naked to another boy in our class as part of some romantic gesture had been caught with the photos in his bag by a teacher, and rumors were spreading like wildfire across the school. Remember, this was long before the internet or cell phones with cameras. Anywho, those two boys got detention because our principal was a jerk, and let me tell you, it was the hype gossip story of the year. So, while R.F. Ant was busy trying to teach us the dangers of the adult adult world and its hideous vices, something more real and immediate was taking place right in our humble school hallways, and we were having secret whisper conversations about it at the back of the darkened classroom. Anyway, I digress. On the wider stage, the D.A.R.E program, short for Drug Abuse Resistance Education, was a fixture in California classrooms throughout the 1990s. From elementary schools in the Central Valley to high schools up and down the coast, it was nearly impossible for a kid growing up in the state during that decade to avoid the signature D.A.R.E experience. The program was everywhere. Uniformed police officers would come into classrooms once a week, armed with large visual aids, booklets, and a well-rehearsed script designed to scare kids away from drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and sometimes even peer pressure itself. Graduation ceremonies capped off the curriculum, and students proudly received D.A.R.E certificates, pencils, and the now iconic black t-shirts with bright red lettering. These shirts, initially meant to signal innocence and abstinence, quickly took on a whole new cultural meaning. Ironically, those who wore them most confidently were often the very teens, sneaking out to parties, smoking weed behind the school gym, or experimenting with the substances they'd been warned about so vehemently just a few years earlier. Despite its reach and strong branding, D.A.R.E was, in practice, a failure. Multiple studies, both during its height and in the years that followed, demonstrated conclusively that the program had little to no lasting impact on preventing drug use among young people. In fact, in some cases, the detailed descriptions of drugs and their effects had the opposite of the intended result. By giving kids a clinical breakdown of what different substances did, how they were consumed, what they looked like, what kind of high they produced, it accidentally planted seeds of curiosity. Many kids admitted later that it was their first real exposure to the idea of drugs as something tangible and possibly even tempting. Rather than being scared straight, they left the classroom with a head full of new terms and scenarios they'd never considered before. D.A.R.E may have meant well, but it turned out to be a case study in how not to communicate with young minds about difficult issues. Which brings us to the larger question: why did so many of these anti-drug campaigns fail to connect with the very audience they were designed to protect? One major problem was tone. Most campaigns spoke down to kids, not with them. The adults behind these efforts, often educators, law enforcement agencies, or out-of-touch nonprofit boards, believed that simply laying out worst-case scenarios or delivering moralistic lectures would be enough to make children comply. They ignored the complexity of the adolescent experience, the confusion, the search for identity, the peer dynamics, the emotional undercurrents that lead kids to experiment with anything from cigarettes to ecstasy. Rather than fostering open dialogue or teaching kids how to think critically, many PSAs and school programs opted for scare tactics, catchphrases, and gimmicks. They turned incredibly nuanced issues, like addiction, trauma, social pressure, or mental health, into shallow cautionary tales or dramatic skits. And in the process, they lost credibility. What did my family do? Well, every situation at home is different. But in our family, we did two things. One, we talked it over like adults, even when we were kids. And two, our parents would introduce us to the concept of vice through movies and TV. When it came to talking it out over dinner, my parents would simply go back and forth with my younger brother and I about their experiences with seeing drugs and what it did to people. Both of them had grown up in the 1960s and 70s. My mom, a San Francisco native, lived through the 1967 Summer of Love. And my dad came from the Netherlands, which speaks for itself. Anyway, neither of them had ever partaken in recreational drug use, but they'd seen it mess with others around them, and simply took the experiences of others as a cautionary tale, one they handed down to us in mealtime conversations where they treated us like adults. They didn't condescend, they didn't talk to us like dummies. They just simply laid out the facts, and that we, as individuals ourselves, have a choice, and that if we did choose this dark path, then we couldn't say we hadn't been warned. However, they also trusted us enough to expect that we wouldn't be suckered in by peer pressure, or going with what was hip and with it. Our parents always put into us the mindset that we are our own people, and peer pressure and going with fads and trends basically turns you into a collective drone, which neither of us ever wanted to be. Their other method was to let us sit and watch adult-rated movies with them for family movie nights. Hard R films like Serpico, The French Connection, Sid and Nancy, and Red Heat. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could any parent let their kids sit through adult movies with themes of drugs in them? Simply put, they served as an introduction for us to the concept of vice and drugs. Sure, they were terrifying, borderline traumatic at times, but after the movie had finished, we would all sit and talk about what we had just seen on screen, and my brother and I, having witnessed the carnage and misery such things can cause, were determined never to end up like that. And thankfully, we didn't. To be clear, though, this method won't work for everyone. Our parents trusted our maturity before subjecting us to this form of education, and if they'd had even an atom of doubt, they would never have done it. So, if I were to give my slice of parenting advice, it would be to make sure your kids are mature enough to appreciate what these films are trying to say, and always have the conversation afterwards. Don't skip it, whatever you do. In real-life situations, like walking the high school hallways of suburban San Francisco in the early 1990s, weed was the most common type you'd see students smoking. One boy in our class was the designated dealer, but he wasn't some mustache-twirling villain trying to corrupt innocent youth. The only drugs he gave out were to those actively seeking it, or were roped in by a friend already roaming that particular social circuit. He never approached me or any of my friends, either because he thought we were squares or because we showed obvious disinterest. As for hard drugs, we knew a few people growing up who went the wrong way on cocaine and heroin, and it did end in tragedy on some occasions. I remember one girl fell in with a pretty bad crowd, and they found her and her boyfriend dead on the sofa of their nasty apartment from an overdose, while another boy, who was actually my brother's bully, went to bed one night after taking a hit and never woke up. With that in mind, yes, there was a drug problem, but no worse than it had been in the 1980s, and certainly not as bad as it has been in recent years. Most people in the real world accepted it as a tragic fact of life. Each story was different, but if you simply kept your head down and showed no real interest, then you could avoid the stereotype of American high schools where you simply couldn't make it from enrollment to graduation without going one toke over the line. That said, not every effort was a complete misfire. A few PSAs stood out for their clarity, compassion, or just their raw honesty. The rare campaigns that took the time to empower kids rather than shame them were the ones that made a difference. Some addressed issues of consent and bodily autonomy in ways that helped children understand boundaries and personal safety. One notable PSA about being touched in a bad way left a deep impression on many kids, not because it sensationalized the subject, but because it gave them a clear sense of agency and language to protect themselves. Similarly, some of the later anti-meth PSAs, especially those that emerged toward the end of the decade, ditched the cartoonish tone and leaned into realism. These ads, often featuring real former addicts or gritty documentary-style visuals, showed the true cost of drug abuse, physical decay, shattered relationships, lost futures. They didn't need a dancing mascot or a clever jingle. They just needed to be real. By the late 1990s, the cultural tone had started to shift. The earlier era of frying egg metaphors and cartoon collabs was fading. In its place came PSAs that felt less like school assignments and more like late-night warnings from people who had lived the consequences. The war on drugs itself was beginning to lose its grip, especially in progressive corners of the West Coast. Public conversations began to pivot toward more humane and realistic approaches. Harm reduction, mental health support, access to treatment, and honest conversations about why people turn to substances in the first place. California, in particular, started moving toward policies that looked less like punishment and more like care. Today, those 90s PSAs are remembered less for their impact and more for their absurdity. They've taken on a second life online, circulating as memes, nostalgia bait, and cringe compilations. They're quoted and joked about, like, "I learned it by watching you," but few would argue they truly shaped behavior in the way they were intended to. For kids growing up in the shadow of skate parks, punk zines, sublime lyrics, and the endless hum of MTV, the PSAs were just part of the wallpaper. The messages may not have kept anyone entirely clean, but the aesthetics, the fried eggs, the slow-motion montages, the haunted piano scores, unforgettable. The irony is that in trying so hard to scare a generation straight, the creators of these campaigns accidentally made content that was weird, wild, and strangely beloved in a way they never intended.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199 on X, we're here just for you.